Nobody says it out loud in church, but a lot of people are thinking it. I take antidepressants or medication for anxiety or a mood stabilizer or something that helps my brain do what other people's brains apparently do on their own. And somewhere along the way, from something maybe a pastor said, or the way a prayer was talked about, or just maybe the general atmosphere of the community where everyone seemed to be doing fine, you picked up on the message that this was a failure. That real faith would not need medication. That if they were praying enough, trusting enough, surrendering enough, the prescription would not be necessary. And so they take their medication quietly, sometimes without telling anyone at church, carrying the treatment and the shame of the treatment at the same time. Now, I want to address that directly because it is one of the most specific ways the church has caused harm to people it was trying to help. And because the Bible, when you read it carefully, does not support that shame, not even close. Now, before we start, I have a question for you. Has anyone, a pastor, a church, or just the atmosphere of Christian community, ever made you feel that needing medical help was a spiritual failure? Leave your honest answer in the comments. I read every one, and this is an interesting one. You might not be alone. Now, in order to do this correctly, we need to do the key scriptures. So 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 5 through 8. He laid down and slept under the juniper tree. Behold, an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. He looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on the coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came again the second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. He arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 9. A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Concerning this thing, I begged the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. He has said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 23. Be no longer a drinker of water only, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. Matthew chapter 9, verse 12. When Jesus heard it, he said to them, Those who are healthy have no need for a physician, but those who are sick do. Followed up by Luke chapter 10, verse 34. He came to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. He set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The idea that medication is a failure of faith is not from the Bible. It developed from a particular way of thinking about the body and the soul, one that treats them as separate, where the soul is the real you, the spiritual part that God cares about, and the body is just a container that faith should be able to override. On that view, if your brain chemistry is dysregulated, prayer should fix it. If you are depressed, you are probably not reading the Bible enough. But the Bible does not treat the body and soul as separate. From Genesis chapter 2, where God breathes life into a body made of dust, the human being is a unity, body and soul together, which means what happens in the body affects the soul, and what the soul carries affects the body. They are not separate systems. They are one person. And a person whose brain needs help to function well is not less spiritual than a person whose brain does not. Elijah is suicidal. He's laying under a tree, asking God to take his life. And what God sends is not a vision, not a word, not a spiritual experience, an angel with food and water. Arise and eat. And then when Elijah has slept, the angel comes back. The journey is too great for you. Arise and eat. Before Elijah hears anything from God spiritually, before the still small voice, before the renewed commission, his body was fed twice. God's first response to a suicidal prophet was physical provision, not a rebuke for lack of faith, not a demand for more trust, food, water, rest, because the body needed care before anything else was possible. If you read that story and conclude that God is indifferent to physical care, you're not reading the same story. Now, two things from Paul that belong in this conversation too. The first is the thorn. Whatever Paul's thorn was, and we do not know for certain, it was chronic, it was painful, and it was not removed despite 3 specific prayers. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Not pray more and the thorn will go away, and that your faith is not strong enough yet. My grace is sufficient in this, through this, while this continues. The thorn stayed, and Paul learned to receive grace inside that ongoing difficulty, not after it resolved. The second one is 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 23. Paul, the apostle, writing to Timothy about ministry, pauses to say, be no longer a drinker of water only, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. Timothy was apparently abstaining from wine entirely, probably to avoid any appearance of impropriety. And it was affecting his health. And Paul says, stop that. Take care of your body. The call to purity was never meant to mean physical neglect. Paul, the man who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else, trust me, I'm still reading through it, told a young church leader to use medicine for his physical condition. Luke chapter 10 contains one of the most well-known parables Jesus told. A man beaten, robbed, left half dead on the road. A priest passes, a Levite passes, a Samaritan stops. And what the Samaritan does is not spiritual. It is medicinal, medical. He bound up his wounds. He poured on oil and wine, the standard medical treatment of the era. Okay, don't do that now. He put the man on his own animal. He took him to an inn and paid for his ongoing care. Jesus holds this up as the definition of loving your neighbor. Not he prayed over him and trusted God for healing, or he bound his wounds. He poured on medicine. He paid for the care. There is nothing in that story that suggests medical treatment is a lesser form of care than a spiritual response. Makes sense. Your brain is an organ, like your heart, like your kidneys, like your lungs. It runs on chemistry, neurotransmitters, hormones, electrical signals across synapses. And sometimes, for reasons that include genetics, trauma, environment, and things we don't fully understand yet, that chemistry gets dysregulated. The same way a heart can have a rhythm problem, the same way a pancreas can stop producing insulin. Nobody tells a diabetic that their need for insulin is a failure of faith. Nobody tells someone with a heart condition that medication is spiritual weakness. The brain is not different. It is an organ, and when an organ needs help, receiving that help is not a failure of anything. It is stewardship of the body that God gave you. If you have been carrying shame about your medication, I want to say as directly as I can that shame did not come from God. It came from a theology that does not take the body seriously enough. It came from communities that confused spiritual maturity with the absence of need. It came from well-meaning people who did not know what they were saying when they implied that faith should fix what your doctor was treating. God sent an angel with food to a suicidal prophet. Paul told a church leader to use medicine for his body. Jesus praised a man who poured oil and wine on a stranger's wounds. There is no version of those stories in which receiving medical care is a failure of faith. I also want to say what this episode is not saying. It is not saying that medication is the only answer or that faith is irrelevant to mental health. Both things are true together. The God who sends angels with food also speaks in a still small voice. Paul received grace sufficient for the thorn and also took care of his body. The Good Samaritan bound the wounds and paid for ongoing care, and Jesus held that up as love. You can pray and take medication. You can trust God and see a therapist. You can have deep faith and a prescription. These are not opposites. They are the whole person, body and soul together, receiving care from every direction it is available. Lord, there are people watching this who have been carrying both a condition and the shame of treating it. Take the shame. It was never yours to give. Let them receive the care the body needs without the weight of what anyone implied about their faith, and meet them as you met Elijah in the physical place with the physical provision that makes the next step possible. The journey is too great, but you know that, and you send what is needed. Amen. I want to close with the detail from Paul's thorn that does not get enough attention. He prayed 3 times, not once with great faith, but 3 times. And the apostle who wrote, "I can do all things through Christ," who planted churches across the Roman world, who had been caught up to the third heaven, prayed 3 times for the same thing and received a different answer. Not your faith is insufficient, and not if you trusted more, this would be removed. My grace is sufficient for you, which means the answer to the 3 sincere prayers from one of the most faithful people in the New Testament was not healing. It was grace inside the ongoing condition. That is not a consolation prize. Paul calls it the thing through which Christ's power rests on him. But it is important for anyone who has prayed for their condition to be removed, sincerely, repeatedly, and is still taking medication, to know that their experience is not outside the biblical story. It is inside it. Paul prayed 3 times. The thorn stayed. And the grace was sufficient. You are not failing. You are in the same story as the apostle who wrote half the New Testament. If you are struggling and need to talk to someone, please reach out to a doctor, a counselor, or someone you trust, because getting help is not weakness. It is what the angel did for Elijah.